Well, very much so. Quite a very significant day as the United Nations Habitat Conference continues in Pretoria. Quite a lot of issues, really at their hearts. It's about the transformation of informal settlements and slums to be better places, to make them more friendly, livable, make sure that the amenities are provided, but also it's all about the improvement of the living conditions. A short while ago, Minister Kubai, responsible for human settlement, signed an MOU with the UN Habitat. So all about strengthening the cooperation and deepening those religious relations between South Africa and this key institution within the UN family. But now, there's quite a lot happening within the urbanization. It's not just happening in certain cities, but obviously so many provinces as well now, but it's time to hear from the perspective of the Eastern Cape. So MEC, thank you so much indeed for your time. We're just talking off air that a lot happens, in the cities, in Johannesburg, and maybe in Nelson Mandela Bay as well. But just give us a sense, as the Eastern Cape, how are you doing when it comes to the informal settlements and making sure that they are well taken care of in terms of services?
Okay. Firstly, in the province, we chose, when you're talking about slums or informal settlements, to regard the traditional villages or traditional areas in OR Tambo Jogabi as slums, because they barely have access to water, no roads, no electricity. So part of our response in the upgrading of informal settlement, we include those traditional and villages and your more rural parts of the province. And our backlog is big. We have some of the oldest townships. We have the issues of Duncan Village that we are currently in the process of dedensifying, but also in trying to bring in the upgrading of informal settlement. Now, the work is harder for us, but the one thing that we are taking away from the conference, and part of the commitments from the resolution of the conference, in how do we accelerate actioning the processes that are already here, because there is a program of upgrading this informal settlement, but it happens a little slow, and we're almost in 2030. So how do we collaborate with the local sphere of government? How do we collaborate with the national sphere of governance to ensure that we accelerate the action in upgrading these areas, not leaving the rural areas? And that's the one thing we are echoing right throughout this conference, because let's not talk about informal settlements in your Buffalo City, East London area, Nelson Mandela, Joburg, and your big cities, while leaving the rural informal settlements behind. And those have not been developed since time immemorial, when you're looking at the apartheid special diversification. But also, as a province, we're looking to retain people of the Eastern Cape to work in the Eastern Cape. How do we induce economic activity? And we want to discuss informal settlement upgrading in the context of growing the economies of our smaller towns and our metros in the province, while still making it more livable, so that we do not lose people to your bigger provinces. Now, the last thing for us as a province is that when you're talking about informal upgrading, you're talking about taking services to where people are. How do we ensure that we secure security of tenure? You may not be in a position now to build a top structure, cement and wall housing, but how do we ensure that the person staying in this informal settlement gets the security in the form of land, in the form of a title deed, and service that piece of land, so that in the coming years, and we're able to commit a house. But also, when you give a land and security of tenure to a family, to a woman, you guarantee generations to come of that family that they will have a legacy, they will have an asset and an investment they can work on. And other children go on and work and access opportunities, and they are able to develop houses, land for their own families. Now, if we can't guarantee that security of tenure, and we hand over the land that we have to those families that are in need, it almost limits the scope of families doing it for themselves as well.
And obviously, MEC, you look at in Gauteng, for example, now you talk about load shedding, now you talk about water shedding. How's your province doing? Because obviously you have limited resources, but you have these competing priorities.
Yeah, Yes, as a province, we are in a difficult space considering the fiscus and our budget. But the one thing that we are focusing on is how do we collaborate. Now we're going into collaboration with the private sector to ensure we have mixed development, building low-income housing. How do we integrate the FLISP and social housing program in order to ensure that those low-income earners, they can afford a house but not the RDP standard house yet? And how does the private sector come in, partner with government to ensure that we provide housing for those? Because a number of people who end up at the informal settlement, some of them are able to work and earn a living, but not high enough for them to afford a bond, but higher for them to qualify for the RDP housing. So we have those engagements, and we're hoping that they will bring in fruition. Now, with the shrinking budget of the department and all other challenges and even social challenges that are confronting us as a country, the province in particular, we want to collaborate. Private sector, community organizations that are coming in, other government departments, so that we leverage on the little that we have to make maximum impact, because you can't run away from the impact of upgrading and ensuring livable conditions, integrated, safer communities, and the offspring of it in the economy, as an example, and other facets of life. And obviously, we are still confronted with other challenges, such as, I think, load shedding, you mentioned, the issues of water, but those issues, government cannot resolve them alone. We really need the private sector to come with their resources, to come with their thinking, collaborate with government, and we leverage on what private sector would be able to access that as government from where we are seated. We unfortunately unable to make an impact on the challenge on our own.
And just before I let you go, MEC, you spoke about encouraging people to stay in the province, not to leave the Eastern Cape. And we do know that urbanization is one of the main drivers of, the mushrooming of the slums, in Johannesburg and so many other cities. But how are you planning to do that? Because it's quite an unstoppable force.
Firstly, the Eastern Cape Provincial Government has a program that seeks to bring in and revitalize the industrial parks in Mthatha, as an example, in the KSDOR Tambo district, in Komani, in the Enoch Mgijima Christiani district, in Nelson Mandela. So those private sector is coming in to open up businesses, and we're hoping it will bring employment opportunities for people. They don't have to go look for work outside the province. Now, where we come in as human settlement, as there's that industrialization coming in, let's work with the private sector to introduce low-income and mixed residential areas, so that we don't bring in, we're not forced to bring or look at informal settlements mushrooming, but we provide housing and settlement opportunities in those areas. Secondly, in the small town revitalization program of the department, where we are trying to bring in the infrastructural investment in the smaller towns in order to induce greater economic opportunities in those small towns. But lastly is that people will only stay when there are opportunities of life, when there is work, when the schools are working, when the health system is working. And we are in collaboration and working with the government departments to ensure that those they work and people can trust them and people have employment opportunities. That's the only way you can ensure people don't leave your province. Otherwise, you have no way of saying don't go and access an employment opportunity when you don't have an alternative within the province.
All right, MEC, quite a very formidable and colossal task that you face ahead. But of course, perspective there from the Eastern Cape. We know that there's quite a lot of knowledge sharing, best practices from all over the world. After all, the UN Habitat is having this massive mandate globally to make sure that, there's an improvement of life in the slums and the informal settlements, but also to provide guidance to member states like South Africa.